Greetings, welcome to Chapter 3, Corporate Crime, Part 1. And we're going to be talking specifically about some of the more well-known corporate crimes and some of the lesser-known ones. So let's review what is corporate crime. Corporate crime are illegal acts committed by employees or officers of a corporation to promote corporate or personal interests. So we had watched the video on Enron where they essentially pumped up their stock price, and then the high-level folks who got stock options as part of their compensation package were then able to sell their stock, making hundreds of millions of dollars. Tyco was a very similar situation. Arthur Andersen was a accounting firm that worked for Enron, was on Enron's board, and they were complicit in some of the accounting fraud that was completed at Enron. So let's look at the history of corporate crime. It's not something that just emerged in the 20th or 21st century. Let's start with the 16 to 1700s, and this is when the rise of trade and shipping companies came about. This is our good friend Christopher Columbus. It's one of his ships. And the crimes they committed, first and foremost, of course, they discovered America. Of course, the millions of Indians who were already living here kind of disagreed. So the Dutch and the British and the Italians and the Spanish, all of the people who came over here, pretty much took out as many American Indians as they could. By the 17 and 1800s, when the United States had been fully formed, had gotten its independence, there was a general theory that the less Indians, the better, and the American government moved very quickly to eradicate American Indians or relocate them to what we call reservations. Also was the development and spread of the slave trade out of Africa. So when we look at these corporate crimes, what do you have to think about? You have to think about what is legal and what is illegal. At the time, slavery was legal in the United States, but it was not legal in some of these other countries that ran the slave trade. So they were taking advantage of the United States legality, even though their own country saw it as illegal. Then we move into the Industrial Revolution, and this is the era of the 17 to 1800s. Manufacturing became one of the major components to the Industrial Revolution, and you saw a variety of crimes being committed, up to and including fraud, stock manipulation, price fixing, exploitation of labor, especially children. And you'll see I have a couple pictures here. This is a little girl pulling a case of coal or wood through a tunnel. Notice how small it is. Children were used to fit into these very small spaces because grown adults could not. Down here you'll see children working in a factory, and again, most of these kids 10, 11, 12 years old. Dangerous, very dangerous conditions. So these unsafe working conditions not only exploited the children, but it also exploited the adults. For example, there's a very famous case called the Triangle Factory Fire, and this was in New York City, and on the top floor of the Triangle Factory they had women sewing, and it was just line after line of women sewing, and there was a fire, and they went to the emergency exits. And they were all locked because the employers did not want the women leaving in the middle of the day to go home or take a break or step outside for a cigarette. Over 100 women died in this factory fire, and it takes that kind of a circumstance for laws to get put in place. Another aspect that was being developed during the age of Industrial Revolution were monopolies. This is where you eliminate the competition. AT&T, American Telephone and Telegraph, was a monopoly until the late 1970s. It was the only phone company. So if you wanted a phone, you called AT&T or AT&T or AT&T. That was it. In the late 1970s, the Supreme Court declared them a monopoly and they broke them up. And then you saw other companies coming in like Singular, Verizon, Motorola, and all of a sudden, phone prices went down, which is one of the benefits of competition. Today, in the modern era, we define a corporation as a group of people authorized by law to act as a legal personality having its own powers, duties, and liabilities. In the last 2 years, a Supreme Court decision called Citizens United came through that declared a corporation is the equivalent of a person, and in as much as they can make political donations. This is very controversial because now we're giving personhood to a entity. And here's some of our more popular corporations in this country: the Walt Disney Company, Target, and Mickey D's. The United States economic system is an example of free market capitalism. And I'm going to define each of those. A free market is defined as an economy in which the forces of supply and demand are not controlled by a government or other authority. So, for example, let's take the price of milk. There's a fairly high demand for milk in this country. We like to give our kids chocolate milk or white milk. We want to put milk in our coffee. We use milk in our food. So milk is something that's used a lot. But because it's used a lot, there's a pretty good supply of it. There's a lot of dairy farms. We figured out ways to make cows give more milk than they used to. So the idea here is that if supply is good and demand is good, the price is going to be a reasonably good price. So, for example, like 99 cents for a pint of milk. Now, let's say, for example, that we have a terrible disease hit all the dairy cows in the United States. And so half of them die, and the other half of them are sick. All of a sudden, there's no more milk in the United States. Well, the demand is going to be still high, but the supply is very low. That means, in that kind of a circumstance, the price is going to skyrocket because this is a high demand product with low supply. Now let's look at it from the other perspective. 20 years ago, the big thing out in the world were Beanie Babies. And everybody said that Beanie Babies were going to become a collector's item. So, the demand for Beanie Babies was high. The supply was relatively low. So people were spending $5 to $10 per Beanie Baby. Well, over the course of the last 20 years, the supply went up. It skyrocketed. The demand stayed the same and eventually dropped off. If you go on eBay these days, you can buy 100 Beanie Babies for about $20, so about 25 cents each. So supply and demand really does determine where our prices are. In a free market, the government nor any other authority should have any control over the price. Now, what we're going to see in this PowerPoint, in part 2 of our PowerPoint, is you're going to see that sometimes companies work together behind the scenes to set certain prices so that the price never goes down significantly. And that's called price fixing. We're also a capitalist society, which means that it's an economic system in which industry is controlled by non-government owners with the goal of making profits. So, if you look at a business today, their number one goal is to make a profit, which is not a bad thing. Now, if you go into a country that's not a capitalist country, so for example, let's say we go to Sweden, which is socialist, their goal is not to make profit as much as pay their expenses and come out at the end of the year being able to pay what they spent. So sort of a zero sum, but they're not as focused in on the profit making. How do Americans feel about corporations? Well, in the last 25, 30 years, we've seen people's attitudes towards corporations go way down. 75% of Americans have a negative view of corporations because they are seen as dehumanizing people, meaning they don't care about people at all in pursuit of profit. In other words, money is more important than people. And the reality is that as much as 75% of us do not like corporations, they don't care because most corporations are owned by a very small number of people. Who manages corporations? You see the president, the chief executive officer, also known as the CEO, the chairman of the board, and they have usually earned or purchased large amount of corporation stock. They will often manage a company to increase the stock price because they own stock. So if the stock price goes really high, they can sell their stock and make more money. So what you see here is something that we call a conflict of interest, because what is best for the company and what is best for stockholders are not always the same thing. And if you remember the movie Enron, the movie about Enron, you can see exactly what I'm talking about here. The people who own the corporation are called stockholders. So for example, let's say that you have an extra $100 sitting in your account and you'd like to buy some stock. So you go online and you say, hey, I love McDonald's. They're my favorite restaurant. I'm going to buy me some McDonald's stock. And you see what the price is selling for. And again, this is also based on supply and demand. So McDonald's is a very safe stock. It is not going to make you super wealthy, but it's also not going to make you broke. So they're usually selling for a decent price, and you can buy it, have that one share of stock, and now you're an official stockholder. However, there are approximately 1 billion shares of McDonald's stock. That means that 1 out of 1 billion, you may have a share of stock, but you do not have any authority in the determination of how McDonald's runs. Now, this next bullet is exactly the problem that occurs in this country, because the vast majority of us do not own enough stock to have any kind of influence. About 1% of the total population in the U.S., that's about 3 million people, own half of the stock in American corporations. There are 300 million people in this country, and only 3 million of them own 50%. Let's just look at the wealth in this country. The wealthiest 10% of American population owns 90% of the stock. That means 30 million people own almost all the stock in this country. The wealthiest 1% of the American population controls 33% of the total net worth of the United States. This is one of the big issues that Americans are dealing with today. There is no distribution of wealth. It is concentrated at the very top. And very few of these extremely rich people want the money to trickle down to the middle class and to the lower classes. For example, look at this guy down here, James Walton. His family owns Walmart. He has $33.6 billion in the bank. He does not want his employees to get a minimum wage increase. Will it come out of his pocket? Not really. Has minimum wage increases come out of other people's pockets? Not really, because usually what happens is when the minimum wage goes up, so do prices. And what you see here is these are the rich men who are preventing these poor people from rising up. Because once they're forced to raise minimum wage, they're just going to raise the prices. So a tube of toothpaste at Walmart is going to be $1 today, and it might be $1.50 tomorrow, because they have to account for the rise in minimum wage. These 10 men, again, we have Bill Gates, technology, Phil Knight, he runs the wonderful world of Nike, Warren Buffett has a conglomerate that runs many different companies. They just recently bought a real estate company. Michael Bloomberg used to be the mayor of New York City, and he owns Bloomberg News. Forrest Mars runs a candy company. James Walton, as I said, is part of the Walton family, and as such, part of Walmart. Michael Dell, $14 billion, runs Dell Computers. David Koch has $32 billion. He and his brother, who's just under him with $30 billion in Kansas, they run a conglomerate of different companies. Sheldon Adelson, Nevada. You know where that is? Vegas, baby. He runs casinos. And then you have Larry Ellison, who is also in high tech. Some of the names that are missing: Zuckerberg from Facebook. He's going to be just below this with about $10 billion or so. Oligopolies. This is when a relatively few corporations control the marketplace. For example, if you live in Philadelphia, which companies can you get cable from? And that's pretty much Comcast or Verizon. They have a Dish, some other companies, but they're so small that they don't really compete against these two big guys. Then we have what's known as a conglomerate. This is when a group of companies operating in different markets under different names are controlled by a centralized owner. So, for example, Procter & Gamble is one of the largest conglomerates in the United States, and they control all of these brands, plus many, many, many others. One of your favorite brands is probably controlled by a conglomerate. So these are the big conglomerates: Kraft, Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, General Mills, Kellogg's, Mars, Unilever, Johnson & Johnson, Procter & Gamble, and Nestle. And if you look at Nestle, they have the more obvious Nescafe, Taster's Choice, Nestea, Perrier, Poland Spring, Jell-O. Jell-O actually belongs to Kraft. Never mind. Nestle candies. Then they also have baby food. They have clothing. They have makeup. Makeup goes to Procter & Gamble. Maybelline over here. L'Oreal. Dog food, cat food. These companies have a variety of different industries, all working under their own name, but they all belong to one company. One of my favorite things here in Coca-Cola world is that they sell Glaceau, Dasani, vitamin water, and Smart Water. These are all waters, and yet they have 4 different names. And I can bet you somebody will say, I like Dasani better than Glaceau, even though it's essentially the same product. There's also something called a corporate transgression. These are activities that are harmful but not necessarily illegal. For example, some companies legally evade paying taxes by shifting profits to subsidiaries in countries with favorable, i.e., low tax policies. So my example here is Microsoft, which you have probably heard of. They have shifted its intellectual property, which is an asset, and it's mobile because it's intellectual property. It's not a building. It's a thought process. It's a computer program. It's an operating system, to subsidiaries in Puerto Rico, Ireland, and Singapore, which are low or no tax jurisdictions, in part to avoid or reduce its U.S. taxes on the profits generated by assets sold by its offshore entities. In other words, they open up a company in Ireland, they move the asset to be housed in Ireland, and instead of paying a certain level of tax in the United States, they're paying very little tax in Ireland. Types of corporate crime. So we're going to be looking at these over the next few days. Corporate violence, corporate corruption and fraud, corporate stealing, and corporate deception. Corporate violence results from policies and actions undertaken by the management of the corporation that results in consumers being exposed to harmful products or conditions. And what that means is A corporation makes a choice. So, for example, they are going to make the choice to sell a toxic waste dump to a school to build its playground, a la the Love Canal. Is it illegal? No. Is it a consequence where somebody will get hurt? Yes. Why do they do this? To maximize corporate profits. One of the most egregious examples of this has been the tobacco industry. Back in the 1950s and 60s, the tobacco industry claimed that they were doing research and they could not find a link between the use of tobacco and cancer. Well, in the 1970s and 80s, it was discovered that the tobacco industry had actually received multiple reports of research that shows that there was a causation between smoking and cancer. And when this happened, and it happened because a whistleblower revealed the research, this changed the entire industry of tobacco. You could no longer market to children, use cartoons. You couldn't put up commercials on during the day or in the evening. Print ads had to be in adult-type magazines. Back in the day, you would see tobacco ads in comic books. Now you can't do that. You'd have to have a tobacco ad in Playboy or Cosmopolitan. More so, this allowed people to sue the tobacco company to say, you were hiding this information. You committed violence against the public. And they've been hit with billions and billions of dollars worth of fines, which is why the vast majority of American tobacco firms are now concentrating their marketing efforts in South America and Eastern Europe, where this information is not that well known. Examples of some corporate violence: unsafe disposal of toxic waste, as we saw in the Love Canal, and unchecked pollutants being released into the air and water. Some of the consequences that we saw were a rise in cancer rates in the 20th century, rise in lung-related diseases like asthma and chronic pulmonary disease, rise in birth defects and genetic disorders. Now over here, this was the BP explosion in the Gulf of Mexico, and what you saw was millions of gallons of oil being pushed into the Gulf, into these waters. And initially they said it was safe, and then they said no, not so much, and they had to do a lot of cleanup. But the point was that they were quite willing to let these pollutants enter the water stream without any concern until people started to complain. And when they complained and they started getting on the news and they got on Twitter and Facebook, it started a revolution in terms of how social media can impact this. Today, just last month, or actually this month, in North Carolina, a coal mine has been dumping ash into a river that feeds the water system. And again, they're saying it's safe. However, keep in mind that despite the corporation saying it's safe, scientists are saying no, it's pollution. It's carbon-based coal dust that is getting into our water system, and that comes with carcinogenics, cancer-causing agents. More corporate violence. We see unsafe products, including food. So I had you read that excerpt from The Jungle that Upton Sinclair wrote at the beginning of the 20th century, but we're still seeing these same issues today. Every time you hear about someone dying from eating bad spinach or eating tomatoes that had pesticides on them, these are unsafe products being added to food, but until somebody dies, we're not really hearing a lot about it. Also, and I discussed this in class Monday, pharmaceutical products like thalidomide was prescribed for morning sickness but caused massive birth defects. Then we also have medical devices. There are faulty heart valves that are put in people's hearts that then have to be removed and replaced because they're not working correctly. Another pharmaceutical product that caused a lot of problems back in the mid-90s was fen-phen. It was a weight loss product, but people ended up dying of lung disease and heart problems. Then we have unsafe transportation products. The Ford's Pinto, this is the car on the top, that's the Pinto, had a gas tank in the rear, which caused the car to explode when it was rear-ended. And, cars get rear-ended on a regular basis. 10 or 15 miles per hour at a red light, that's going to cause some significant damage. But in this case, the gas tank would explode, which meant the whole car exploded, and people were dying. And this was a cheap car. It was $2,000, and so a lot of the people driving it were young. And when young people die, it's a big deal. The car on the bottom here, this is called the Chevy Corvair. It was a sports car, and its steering mechanism didn't work, nor did its exhaust system. Ralph Nader is a consumer advocate, and he wrote a book called The Corvair, Unsafe at Any Speed. And essentially, it was taken off the market. Interestingly, both cars today are highly collectible because of how unsafe and how fast they had to be removed from the market. Then we have corporate violence against workers. And this is, again, when companies display willful indifference to the health and safety of their employees in pursuit of higher profits. Here's some statistics. You'll find them in the book. 3.6 million workplace injuries every year. That's almost 2% of the workforce. Approximately 17 American workers die each year or each day due to work-related injuries. Years ago, I worked with a woman whose husband worked for the streets department, and he got ran over by a guy driving a truck who wasn't paying attention, and he got squished. Just in general, estimated about 100 American employees die each year due to gross indifference or intentional wrongdoing. Gross indifference means they just don't care. Some examples of this are exposure to chemicals or other toxic substances without proper safety clothes. We're going to look at corporate corruption and fraud next in part 2. These activities include financial manipulation, trademark and copyright violations, misrepresenting facts in advertisements, unfair labor practices, financial fraud, and war crimes. And I have a little chart over here. This is from the FBI, starting in 2007 and going to 2011. So if you kind of want to think, the first two represent the era of George W. Bush, and from 2009 to 2011, this is the era of President Obama. And there's not much of a difference, you'll see. 529 up to 726, 150 more cases. However, this is not a huge number because, remember, politicians need political donations to get elected. And who gives them the big money? Is it you? Is it me? Heck no. It is corporations. So most presidents are not keen on pursuing prosecutions against corporate criminals because that is literally biting the hand that feeds you. So we'll pick this up in part 2, and have a great day. Email or text me if you have any questions. Thank you.